Next Saturday, I'm going to be on a panel at Mount Leo. We're going to discuss 3 topics, and one of them is going to be this miracle. So I'm doing some work on this and thought I'll present this here tonight, the beginning of miracles. And you're going to be familiar with this. It's when Jesus turns the water into wine. Now let's read it, and I'll show you why I call it the beginning of miracles. John chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. And the 3rd day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." And there were set 6 water pots of stone after the manner of purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw out now and bear it to the governor of the feast." And they bare it. When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, he knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew. The governor of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man at the beginning doth set forth a good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine till now. This is the beginning of miracles, this beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him." The beginning of miracles. Well, at least it's the beginning in Cana of Galilee. And we never read of any miracle that he ever did before this. This may very well be the very first of all the miracles he did, and that's going to raise an interesting question, I think, a little bit later on. But what are we talking about when we talk about miracles? Well, there's 3 words that refer to this. And we read them in Acts chapter 2 when Peter stood up. I think it's in verse 24. Peter stands up and says about Jesus that did miracles and wonders and signs. Those 3 words. And they have a little different meaning. That word miracle is not this word miracle. It's a little different. And it's a word that means power. Power. It's not always referring to supernatural power. You remember the parable of the talents when Jesus gave to every man according to his ability? Well, that word ability is according to his power, and that's the word. That wasn't a miraculous power, but most of the time it does. It's a supernatural power. And then it talks about wonders. That word in the King James Version is used 16 times, and every time it's talking about an act of God that would make you wonder. That's what it's talking about. So that's the word for wonders. But then it says signs. And that gives you some idea of the purpose of the miracle. It was to signify something. That's the word used here. And some of your translations might have that. This beginning of signs did Jesus in Cana of Galilee. So there's 3 words there referring to the things that we're talking about that we usually call miracles. Now, Jesus had just come from gathering his disciples. And here's something that you might call a miracle. It's in the previous chapter, John chapter 1. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile." Now, they had never met. And Philip's thinking, he doesn't know me. What's he calling me that for? Nathanael said unto him, "Whence knowest thou me?" And Jesus answered him, "Before that Philip called thee, when thou wast under the fig tree, I saw thee." Now that might not sound like much, but it was enough for Nathanael. Look what Nathanael's response to that was. Nathanael answered and said unto him, "Rabbi, thou art the Son of God. Thou art the King of Israel." Now what's going on here? And John has this way of writing to us sometimes where he doesn't really explain it. He tells it and kind of leaves us to wonder, wait a minute, what is going on here? I take it that Nathanael was under the fig tree where he couldn't have been seen. And there was something going on under that fig tree. Maybe he was praying to God or thinking through something. Whatever it was, Jesus knew all about it. And it was enough to convince Nathanael, this is no ordinary man. What they're saying to me about you must be true. Thou art the Son of God. That's amazing. And Jesus said, because I saw thee under the fig tree, believest thou? Thou shalt see greater things than these. I went through with my little Dixon study Bible. It's my favorite study Bible, I think. It's got a chart in there of the miracles of Jesus. It doesn't list this one as a miracle, but something's going on here, isn't there? But it mentioned 35 specific miracles of Jesus. Now, 7 are in the book of John. And this turning the water into wine is the first one. He said, verily I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. There's so much there. I'm going to have to pass this. He called him the Son of God, and Jesus called himself the Son of Man. Well, we'll just have to save that for another time, but that's interesting too. But now it says the third day. And the third day from what? Well, I'm convinced, look, you may not be sure, but I'm convinced this is the third day from the day he talked with Nathanael. 3 days later. And he's back up in Galilee. It says there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee. Now, that's where the map will show you where Cana is. But if you read a little more detail, you see Nazareth. I pointed to Nazareth, Cana. You can see Capernaum over there near the Sea of Galilee. I did a little reading on this. You know, they don't really know where Cana was. They've got 2 places that they say it might have been here, it might have been there, and they're not sure about either one. What does that tell you? Cana was a small little village. It wasn't a significant town, or they would know where it was. It's somewhere between Nazareth and Capernaum, because Mary is there from Nazareth. She wouldn't have been too far from home. It's in Galilee, and afterward they all go to Capernaum, so it's somewhere out there. But the significance here is it's kind of an out-of-the-way place, off the beaten path, a small, obscure village, and this is how Jesus begins. Those 35 miracles, you remember reading some about Jesus did it and said, now don't tell them I did this for you. Well, they couldn't help it. They went out and told everyone. But he starts off real quiet with these miracles. It's toward the end where he's doing them in front of everyone so that all can see. But at the beginning, he's trying to do these things mostly somewhat subtly and behind the scenes. He's easing into this at his own timing. So, the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. Now, you have this marriage. Here's what they do. You know, marriage is a big event, isn't it? I mean, it's a big event. And those that have ever helped their children through a wedding, they know there's a lot of planning goes on from both sides of the family, and you want it all to pull together, and it's always quite a production. Now, you don't have to do that. You know, you could just get go down to the courthouse, I guess, and just declare you and get on with it that way. But usually we make a big deal out of a wedding, and that's because marriage is a big deal. I mean, you're going to be with this partner for life, and you want to make sure you've made a good choice. And it was a big deal in the days of Jesus. Here's how they did it. They did it a little different than we do. You know, when we have a marriage ceremony, then you go to the reception. And when I remember, reception was cake and mince and punch. You know, that was the reception. Boy, now it's a meal. I mean, sometimes they really rolled it out, and it is a feast. It's got to be a major effort to put on a meal like that. And it's usually the bride's family that puts on this feast that occurs after the wedding. That's not how they did it then. They would be betrothed, and that's kind of like being engaged, but you'd be legally bound to get married. So you're going to have a wedding if you're betrothed. You have to get a divorce not to have the wedding once you're betrothed. And so you're betrothed. And then when the wedding comes, it's the groom that goes over to the bride's house, and she's all fixed up for the groom. And he takes her from her house, and they have a kind of like a parade, a procession right through town over to the groom's house. And it's the groom that has prepared the feast. So there's a great feast. And this feast, look, I've seen some weddings where they had quite a spread after the wedding ceremony. But this feast could last for days. So this was really a big deal. And Jesus went. Yeah, I just think that's significant. That Jesus was there at the beginning of that marriage. And that's where you want to start, isn't it? We want Jesus at the start of our marriage. Now, he won't be there in person, but we want this. Look, we want Jesus there. He wouldn't have been there if that had been a man marrying a man, or a woman marrying a woman, or someone marrying a woman marrying someone else's husband, or a man marrying someone else's wife. He wouldn't have been there to honor that. This must have been an honorable wedding of two that were going to be blessed by God. God joined them together, and Jesus thought it was important too. He was a sociable person, and he honored marriage by being at that wedding feast. Now, his disciples were there. Well, he had about 5 now. Let's see, that would be John, Andrew, who got Peter, Philip, who got Nathaniel. I guess there could have been more, but there's about 5, 6, Jesus, and you have this feast. You just send everybody come to the marriage feast. And so Jesus shows up, his mother's there, and that makes you think his mother must have known those that were getting married, and just, invite Jesus in with the men following him, and invite him in. So they're all coming into this wedding feast. Now, they wanted wine. That means that they were running out. Want here is not in the idea of desire. It means a lack. They were either running out or had run out. And socially, that would be an embarrassing thing to do. It was responsible for the groom to make sure everyone had enough provisions for this feast. And to run out of the wine at the marriage feast, that would just be a real social. You know how people talk. He didn't even have enough wine for the wedding feast, and you didn't want that going on. So they were running out of wine, and the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Now, watch this. Mothers and sons. There's a special relationship going on here. You've seen it before where 2 people are talking and you don't know what they're talking about, but both of them know. Both of them know just exactly what they're talking about. And you don't know what they're talking about. Mary turns to Jesus and says, they have no wine. And she's not just informing him. Jesus and his mother knew each other well enough where she knew if I tell him that, he's going to think I need to do something. Now, men, we got to be careful here, men. Sometimes our wife will bring to us a problem. And sometimes that means do something, solve that for me. She doesn't have to ask you to solve it. She just brought the problem, and that means you need to solve it. But sometimes that's not what she wants. She doesn't want you to solve it. She just wants you to know there's a problem so that you can feel for her. And it's hard to tell the difference sometimes, isn't it? But Jesus and his mother, she just turns to Jesus and says, they have no wine. She didn't say, you need to get them some wine. She said, they have no wine. And Jesus knew what that meant, coming from his mama. And look how he responded. Now, this is interesting. You see, we get further into this relationship as we go. And it's one of these things where John doesn't tell you. He's going to let you figure this out. So Jesus said to her, woman, what have I to do with thee? Now, when he says woman, don't think that's disrespectful. When Jesus was on the cross and he looked down and saw his mother standing next to John, he said, woman, behold thy son. To call his mother woman, that is not well, we might say that in a way that's disrespectful, but Jesus wasn't doing that. That's not disrespectful. He says, what have I to do with thee? Now, how do you explain that? Some of us remember. Bradley, you might remember sooner than we did, but a lot of we'll think back when your mother kind of put you up to something, and maybe in front of people, and what do you do? Oh, Mom? So, Mom, what are you doing? You know, like, I don't do this. And that's kind of what Jesus seems like he's doing here. Mom, woman, what have I to do with thee? He says, this is putting me on the spot here, Mother. And then he said this. Let's get further into this relationship. Mine hour is not yet come. Now, Jesus does refer to his death, his crucifixion. That's when his hour comes. That may not be what he's talking about here. But whatever he's talking about, his mother knew what he was talking about. They must have talked. And it just makes me wonder, how much had he already explained to her about who he was and what he was going to do? She knew what his hour meant. I take it from this that Jesus is saying, well, the time isn't right for this. But she understood what the hour was going to be, whatever that was. And it just shows something about that mother-son relationship they had. And then this does too. She ignored him. She just turned to the serpents and says, whatever he says to you, do it. I mean, she didn't take this as no. He said, my hour's not yet come. She knew that didn't mean he wasn't going to do it. So she just turns to the servant and says, no, whatever he tells you, you do it. It's like, and then she leaves the scene. She's out of the picture now. She's turned it over to Jesus, told the servant, you do what he tells you. And she leaves it with him. So here's what Jesus did. There were set 6 water pots of stone after the manner of the purifying of the Jews. Now the Jews were very much into ritual purifying. This wasn't something to wash the dishes with, okay? You remember the Pharisees, that they wouldn't eat till they'd wash their hands, you know. And it was like dipping it into the water. And they'd dip in cups and vessels and purify. And this much purifying water, 6 pots that contain 2 to 3 firkins apiece. Now, that when we were over in Israel, one thing they had was these, I keep forgetting that, mitzvah. It looked like a little baptistry. It's a bath. And they'd fill them up with water, and they were always immersing themselves in water and coming up. And it was a purifying. They said there would be enough water in those pots to fill up one of those baths. And maybe that's what that was for. But whatever it was a lot. Now, if you look at the New King James Version, it says containing, what does it say, Bradley? Do you have New King James Version? 20 to 30 gallons? 20 to 30 gallons apiece, these pots. A firkin, well, I read a firkin may be between 8 and 10 gallons. And this is an exact measurement. 20 to 30, they give you 15, wouldn't it? Well, 20 to 30. Yeah, but you figure this up. At the least, there was 100 gallons here. And it could have been as much as, well, it could have been over 150 gallons here in these pots when you start working this out. This is a lot here, enough to fill a bath. So, 2 or 3 firkins apiece. And Jesus said, fill the water pots up with water. and they filled it to the brim. I think it's interesting that John thought that was important. They filled it to the brim. That means right up to the top, doesn't it? Now, when we were growing up, the orange juice that we drank was from frozen concentrate. Now, usually we don't get that now. We just get it all fresh squeezed Florida orange juice. But we had frozen concentrate. And you'd take that and you open that can up and mix it with water. And the time you stirred it all up, it tastes like orange juice. You know, and that's similar to one of the things that the Jews would do with wine. They would boil this down and concentrate it. And then when they wanted to drink it, they'd put it in water and they'd stir it all up and it'd give it a grape flavor to the water. So you fill those water pots up, and then Jesus kind of had something to slip in there. No, it was filled to the brim. It was fit. There wasn't room for anything else in there. This was no trick being pulled. So they filled it to the brim, and he said, draw out now and bear it to the governor of the feast. And they bear it. Now just think, if you were the governor of the feast, here, you're responsible for what's going on, to look after things at that feast so the groom doesn't have to do it. And if Mary knew they were running out of wine, I bet the governor of the feast knew too. Don't you think he might have been a little bit worried about that? And imagine his relief when they bring him this mug full of this wine, and the ruler of the feast tasted that was made wine. I'm going to skip this. And then it says, and the governor of the feast called the bridegroom and said unto him, every man at the beginning does set forth the good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse, but thou hast kept the good wine until now. I mean, the relief that he had some, and then he tasted it, and the surprise that this is so good. That was not what he was expecting. And so I think that's kind of interesting there, to be empathetic here with the ruler of the feast. Now, he didn't know where it came from. The ruler of the feast, he knew not whence it was. Now, the servants that drew the water knew. See how Jesus did this miracle? It was filled to the brim. Obviously, this is a miracle. But not many knew it. The servants knew. I think of those shepherds keeping watch over their flocks by night, and the angels appeared to the shepherds. Didn't appear to Herod and the rulers of the Jews and the chief. Appeared to the lowly, the meek and the lowly. Jesus says, I'm meek and lowly in heart. The servants are the ones that knew what had happened. Not the governor of the feast or the bridegroom. All those guests, they didn't know where all that. They weren't thinking about that. But the servants knew. And his disciples knew, because they believed on him. I bet his mother knew too. But he did the miracle that was obviously a miracle, and only a few knew about it. And they were the servants. They knew what was going on in the kitchen. While they were out there in the feast, they didn't know anything about this. He wasn't putting on a show, was he? But it was enough. It was enough. Now, was it alcohol? That's the question that always comes up. Did Jesus turn the water into alcohol? You know what alcohol is, don't you? It's an intoxicating beverage. And you know what intoxicating means? You know why they call it intoxicating? Because it's toxic. It's poison. I mean, I said, did Jesus turn the water into poison? Is that what he's doing here? They said, well, it said he turned the water into wine. How would you even raise that question? And people read that, and that's what we're reading in the English. But their word for a wine was generic. It didn't tell you about the nature of that drink. In fact, it's interesting. John 2:9, the water was made wine. But in Isaiah 65 and verse 8, the prophet talked about new wine found in the cluster. Now, the cluster is a cluster of grapes. And the wine is in the cluster. It hadn't been squeezed out of the grapes yet. Now, that was in Hebrew. But when the translators in Alexandria translated that in the Septuagint. They use the same word for wine here that John used for wine in John 2 and verse 9. The word wine itself will not tell you whether it was alcohol or not. It just doesn't tell you that. Only that it was the fruit of the vine is all it's going to tell you. But it doesn't tell you the nature of it. So that doesn't mean it was alcohol because it's called wine. Well, what about is the good wine? I mean, man, this is the good stuff. Now, you hear that today, and people think, well, this must be alcohol wine, that this is the good stuff. But did he turn the water into champagne? Is that what we're talking about here? There wasn't even such a thing as champagne. What does it mean? This is the good stuff. This is the good wine. You say the good wine till now. Well, let me tell you what happens. You take the grapes to the wine press, and you squeeze out the juice. And the fresh juice has all the sugars in it, and it's very sweet. But you save it, and those sugars begin to ferment into alcohol. But it doesn't all just go to alcohol. It ferments into alcohol, and as it's doing that, some of the alcohol ferments into vinegar. Well, when I make my pepper sauce, I always use red wine or white wine vinegar. There's no alcohol in it. So it's going through this process of going from sweet wine to wine with some alcohol to wine with some alcohol and vinegar. Eventually it'll all be vinegar. And it doesn't taste as good. So the taste deteriorates over time. What would that tell you then that the good wine was? That'd be the sweet wine. I mean, that'd be the very best, wouldn't it? You've said the best, because they were interested in trying to preserve the sweetness of it. And so the good wine probably means it was good sweet wine. It was the taste that impressed the governor. Now, look what else he said in John 2:10. Every man at the beginning thus set forth good wine, and when the men is well drunk, then that which is worse. But I'll skip the good wine till now. Well drunk. That means drunk freely. That means they'd had a lot. You see, people will say, well, Jesus turned water into wine, and they'll do that to justify moderate drinking. But this won't justify moderate drinking. You know, they must have had an abundance to start with and were surprised they ran out. They had already drunk a lot of whatever wine they had. And then Jesus produces this, and he didn't give them a little. He's rolling out 100 to 150 gallons of this. Do you think he was getting them drunk? I mean, here they've already, if that word, well drunk, if that meant alcoholic wine, they were already drunk, and he's giving them more alcohol? Well, that creates some problems, doesn't it? That makes it difficult. Well, what about this one? Habakkuk 2 and verse 15. Woe unto him that giveth his neighbor drink, that putteth a bottle to him and maketh him drunken. Now, that's what Jesus would have been doing if it was alcohol, because it was such an abundance. And Jesus wasn't doing that. And then this. John 2, 12 through 13. This is right after the wedding feast. They went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brethren and his disciples, that they continued there not many days, and the Jews' Passover was at hand. And Jesus went up to Jerusalem, the Passover. Okay, the Passover is in early spring. That dates this. This was sometime in the early spring where they had this marriage in Cana of Galilee. Now, let me tell you something about the vintage. You harvest the grapes in late summer and early fall, don't you? That's when they become ripe. And then they have to be preserved over the time. And here they are, probably 4 to 6 months away from the harvest. And it would be difficult to preserve that. And yet when they taste it, it's so good. Well, by then, it's not very good anymore. So that tells you, would that be alcohol? It doesn't sound like it. I mean, what would be the greater miracle? To produce some old wine that hadn't spoiled too bad, or to produce some fresh, sweet wine like it just come from the grape way off in the springtime of the year? That would be the greater miracle, wouldn't it? And it says here that he manifested forth his glory. Now, this was glorious. This was really something astounding. That how could you even have such wine as this at that time of year? So all those things make me think it wasn't alcohol. But it's the beginning of miracles. There's that word, signs. It's the beginning of signs. He manifested, that is, he revealed his glory. Who did he reveal it to? To the servants. His mother knew. To those disciples who said, you'll see greater things than these. What was it a sign of? Jesus is the Son of God. And so now they had reason to believe on him. He's giving them evidence. They believed on him. I want to close it this way. What Mary said to those servants. Whatever he says to you, just do it. Just do it. Isn't that good advice? Say, whatever Jesus says to us, just do it. Just do what he says. Do you believe on him? The miracles were the signs, the evidence for us to believe. Now, when he says do something, if you believe on him, just do it. Just do what he says. And it'll be glorious. That's why I extend the invitation off of this, Bradley. If he says be baptized, just do it. Just do what he says. If you need to respond to the invitation tonight, then do it as we stand and sing.